Happy holidays from all of us here at Wealthion to all of you. I'm one of your hosts here at Wealthion, Andrew Brill. We took a look back at this year and hope you enjoy these favorite guest moments from one of our best interviews of 2024.
So, Neil, you mentioned that your latest book is titled The Fourth Turning is Here. Maybe you can just touch on that and provide the gist behind it for those people who might not be familiar with it.
Yeah, well, it takes the same basic thesis of our original book, but it brings it up to date. I mean, you know, we talk about Trump, we talk about the current kind of wave of populism and authoritarianism coming around the globe. I talk more in this book than we did in the original about generational rhythms as a global phenomenon, not just a U.S. phenomenon or American phenomenon. The fact is that World War II and the Great Depression were global crises, right? And that we had it impacted not just America, obviously, but the entire English-speaking world, all of Europe, including Russia and Asia. I mean, East Asia, South Asia, India achieved its independence. My God, all of East Asia went through an absolutely traumatic period. And then in the 1970s, the world went through an awakening. It wasn't just in Berkeley or Columbia University. It was in Paris. It was in Prague. It was in Milan. It was everywhere. It was in Beijing. I mean, that was the time of the Red Guard and the cultural generation revolution, born after the real Chinese Civil War and the revolution there, throwing away 2,000 years of Confucian culture. It was certainly all over Latin America. This rage of young people against the powerful institutions built by their, World War II winning parents, right? This was global. This wasn't just America. And this is one of the reasons why we find these patterns toward, very often boomer-aged ethnocentric rulers, like a Narendra Modi or a Xi Jinping or, the new guy who just got in Malaysia. I mean, you can go around the world now, just point them out, are the way they are. It's not just Trump, it's not just even Jair Bolsonaro. I mean, it's all over the place. And why this happens, we think we can explain it, right?
And you touched on something I just want to clarify, but you said the 1960s was a period of awakening, and yet we saw a lot of turmoil during the 1960s with the assassination of JFK, MLK, also Robert Kennedy.
The awakenings involve a tremendous amount of argument and violence. I mean, that is typical of awakenings. Another awakening is the English Civil War. We beheaded Charles I. But what is characteristic of an awakening is that it's tearing down the system, not so much banding together and building up a new system. I think that was the difference between the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, right? The English Civil War gave rise to a regime which quickly, disappeared. We had the Restoration. It gave rise to nothing permanent. The Glorious Revolution, on the other hand, that was a crisis era. That was a fourth turning, and it gave rise to something permanent afterward, right? That lasted. That is the key difference between an awakening and a crisis. An awakening is youth rising up to overthrow institutions that are too strong. And to allow more individualism to thrive. A crisis is when youth band together to reinforce and save institutions which are too weak, right? And that's the fundamental difference from today. I think millennials are an order-seeking generation. They're not an order-fighting generation. I mean, I have millennials. I talked to millennials about what boomers did back in the late 1960s and 70s. We thought, income inequality, we hated it. It was this huge monolithic middle class. We thought it was terrible. All those suburban homes, that all look just the same, all built out of ticky-tacky. That was a Melvina Reynolds song. It was all those little homes all look the same. That was Pleasant Valley Sunday. That was like horror. That's the last thing we wanted. So we got rid of the middle class. We got rid of all those brightly colored homes. And I talked to millennials today, and they said, that sounds really nice. Little houses, they all look just the same. Wait, where's the middle class? Where can I sign up? I tell them, no, we got rid of it. So, but you see, that's the difference, right? We were an order destroying generation for all the right reasons, because boomers always have the right reasons. They always did things for the right reason. But millennials are an order seeking generation. And I think that's how you explain this movement toward authoritarian leadership around the world. Millennials don't care as much about democracy, saving all the procedures and everything. They want a system that actually works. They see ineffectiveness and sclerosis institutions around the world. They see institutions not doing anything anymore. Boomers, when coming of age, we thought institutions worked too well, right? That's, I think, a fundamental difference.
So you are suggesting that we're in a period of crisis right now. Maybe you can just tell us when it started and when do
Well, it started with a global financial crisis, just like 1929. It started with the GFC, right? 2008, and it will go for we reckon about 23 years. So I mean, a typical phase of life. So that'll be a time when every generation will move into another phase of life. So it'll be over by the early 2030s, and then we'll have a new first turning. So the first turning is, think of these like seasons of a year, right? So it's kind of like, spring, summer, winter, fall. Spring, summer, fall, winter. And the first turning is when the prophet archetype, this is the boomer-like generation, is being born, right? The war child generation is coming into young adulthood. That would be the silent generation. And the war hero generation is beginning to move into midlife. That would be the GI generation, right? And that was in America, that was the American high. That would have been the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy. That was a period of great order, great prosperity. Institutions worked very well. Everyone knew what to do. Everyone was giving their marching orders. And we were very prescriptive about how you ought to run your life. I mean, if you were a guy, you're supposed to go out and become a wage earner. If you were a girl, you're supposed to, become a homemaker. Everyone had their role, right? We felt very good about ourselves collectively. We were pretty modest about ourselves individually. No one really talked about, soft drink ads back then were things like, say Pepsi, please, or something like that. Very decorous, very. No do ads back then, right? Anyway, the next season was the awakening, and that would have been the late 60s, 70s, early 80s. I mean, that really started, it obviously was spearheaded by youth, boomers, and it started more on the left, on college campuses, and particularly on cultural issues like the patriarchy and burning your draft card, burning your bras, just burning all symbols of authority. But I think it rapidly shifted until by the late 1970s, early 1980s, it was more on the right. It was get rid of taxes, get rid of regulation. But the common theme was get rid of social obligation, allow people to do what they want, right? And that was very controversial at the time, and it involved a huge amount of screaming, particularly kids against parents. Go back and watch All in the Family, and Meathead is always just screaming at Archie Bunker. Anyway, it was a traumatic period, but we came out of that with a newly individualized society. And I think the third turning would have been basically the early 1980s until the GFC. And that was a period of great individualism in America, when we less regulation, less taxes, less emphasis upon requiring anyone to do anything. You go into a bookstore and the most upbeat books are about me, myself, and I. And all the downbeat books are about, the end of society, the end of community, right? So this is typical of a third turning of the fall season, what we call unravelings. the what we call the nomad archetype, born and raised during the awakening, is beginning to come of age. This would be Gen X, right? But back in that was in the roaring 90s, but in the roaring 20s, it was a lost generation, a very similar kind of generation coming of age. And the 1920s, the 1990s, the 1850s, 1760s, these are all wild decades of cynicism, bad manners, weak civic authority. And I think that was the period we went through back then. It was much the opposite of a high. Remember, during the high, institutions are strong, individualism is weak. This is a time when individualism is strong, institutions are weak, right? And I think ever since then, we've moved into the fourth turning. And that's when we rediscover community, we rediscover authority, and we refashion large civic institutions from the ground up. And typically the climax comes late in the period. So I think most of the heavy lifting is still to come.
Oh, so if let's just assume we have another 10 years left of this crisis period, and we're approaching the climax, what would you expect to happen?
Well, typically conflict. I mean, I'll just throw it out there. I mean, all the total wars of American and sort of the whole Anglo-American tradition, every total war has occurred during a fourth turning, and every fourth turning has had a total war. So that kind of gives you a clue, right? And that means it's a dangerous time. It's absolutely a dangerous time. And one question I mentioned earlier is the whole question about, will it be internal or external or some combination of the two? And I think that's one thing I actually talk about in the book, is the extent to which conflicts are perceived as being external or internal. Obviously, the Civil War was almost entirely internal, right? Almost by definition in our history, although even then, typically what happens in a civil war is the weaker or losing power tries to draw in a foreign ally. I mean, that just always happens. During the American Revolution, the Americans drew in France, which kind of saved our ass, ultimately at Yorktown, and basically just diverting the Britain into doing a million other things around the world. So this typically happens. There is no unalloyed purely external or purely internal conflict. And we have to remember that we look back upon World War II as the so-called good war. Is very clear, who's going to win. And so very important to remember that up until about a year before Pearl Harbor, we were a profoundly isolationist country. And that the big division in America was between left and right, between those who favored the New Deal and those who hated it. I mean, half of America, so probably less than half of America, thought the 1930s was the red decade, and the other half thought it was the fascist decade. I mean, in the context of the Great Depression, liberal democracy seemed to have no future. It was either communism or fascism. You know what I mean? It was a dire time in America, and as events showed, right, with obviously the fall of France, and then the putting through the big armaments bills, the two Navy bill, and so on in Congress, America began to galvanize, over the course of late 1940, early 1941, and ultimately into Pearl Harbor. But that was by no means foreordained, right? And most Americans thought that the Great Depression never ended by the end of 1940. I think the long-term yield on bonds reached its all-time low in the middle of, I think, June of 1940. And we still had deflation. Unemployment was still in double digits. Most Americans thought the Great Depression was still not over. And it was a profoundly divided nation in terms of where we should go. I think the similarities to today are kind of unmistakable, right? A nation divided with itself, with growing foreign threats, in a world where authoritarianism is now gaining strength. I mean, you don't have to draw it out too much to see that we're going through some of these same some of these same trends. An economy which is not providing higher living standards for young people. You see a record share of young adults living with their parents. When was the last time we had that? 1940, right? Late 1930s. All the young people were living with their parents, just like today. Those Frank Capra movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, You Can't Take It With You. They always show these old Victorian ramblers with the young adults living in the top floor. And, they're all living together. No one built new houses during the 1930s. But we kind of forget this, right? We forget how we replay these things. And I think also the younger generation developed a collective persona as being better behaved. And better suited to a more optimistic, community-oriented approach to public problems than the older generation was back in the 1930s. I think we see that again too today. Every generation has its strengths, and I think we see them manifested much the same way.
Thanks again for watching these favorite moments of 2024, and we hope we can continue to provide you with information that'll help you invest wisely and be financially resilient. Wishing all of you a healthy, happy, safe, and prosperous 2025.